This is the ninth and final lecture in the Random Forest series. In this lecture, we're going to learn about outlier detection using IsolationForest. In the previous lecture, we looked at how to detect outliers using the Random Forest proximity matrix. Since Random Forest is a supervised learning algorithm, it can detect outliers by taking the target class labels into account. This time, we'll study IsolationForest, which is an unsupervised outlier detection algorithm. Although its name includes the word forest, IsolationForest is not part of Random Forest. The purpose of this lecture is to compare the outlier detection algorithms used by Random Forest and IsolationForest and to understand how they differ. IsolationForest, or iForest, is an unsupervised outlier detection algorithm proposed by Tony Liu and his colleagues in 2008. Like Random Forest, IsolationForest also uses an ensemble of trees. It performs both row sampling and feature sampling. However, unlike Random Forest, IsolationForest randomly samples the training data without replacement to create a small subset. Feature sampling is also different. Instead of selecting the best feature and the best split point, IsolationForest randomly selects one feature and then randomly chooses a split point within the range of that feature. The following figure, taken from the original paper, shows the outlier detection results. The blue points represent normal samples, and the red points represent outliers. You can see that the detected outliers are located far away from the overall data distribution. The figure on the right shows the result obtained from a random subsample. These samples were identified as outliers. For comparison, here are the Random Forest outlier detection results from the previous lecture. Since Random Forest is a supervised learning algorithm, it can use the target class labels and take the distribution of each class into account. The detected outliers are located near the decision boundary. As a result, the two methods produce different results because one is based on supervised learning, while the other is based on unsupervised learning. Now, let's take a closer look at the key idea behind IsolationForest. Outliers tend to be isolated much more quickly than normal samples in an isolation tree. Let's look at a simple example. Let's say we have the following two-dimensional training dataset. The blue points represent normal samples, and the red point represents an outlier. The procedure for building an IsolationForest is as follows. First, we randomly sample the training data to create a small subset. Next, we build an isolation tree using that subset. We then repeat this process to generate multiple isolation trees. The procedure for building a single isolation tree is as follows. First, randomly select one feature. Next, randomly choose a split point within the range of that feature. Split the data at the selected feature and split point. Repeat this process until each leaf node contains only one sample. Let's say this procedure produces the following two isolation trees. Together, these two trees form an IsolationForest. In practice, Each tree is built from a randomly sampled subset of the training data. However, for simplicity, let's assume that both trees are built from the entire dataset. Since both the feature and the split point are selected randomly, the trees have different structures. Notice that the red outlier tends to appear near the top of each tree, while the blue normal samples tend to appear much deeper in the trees. In the first tree, the path length of the red sample is 2. In the second tree, its path length is 3. Therefore, the average path length of the red sample in this forest is 2.5. In other words, the shorter the average path length, the more likely the sample is to be an outlier. After computing the average path length for every sample, we can identify the samples with relatively short average path lengths as outliers. This is the key idea behind IsolationForest. The authors of the paper considered one additional factor. The average path length depends on the size of the dataset. For example, in this dataset with 18 samples, the average path length of the red sample is 2.5. If the dataset contained 180 samples instead, its average path length would be longer. This is because the red sample would likely appear deeper in the tree. To account for the effect of the dataset size, the authors normalized the average path length. This allows us to obtain anomaly scores that are independent of the dataset size. Next, let's take a closer look at how the anomaly score is computed. This is a more detailed version of Isolation Tree 1 from the previous slide. Each leaf node contains a single sample, and the maximum depth of the tree is 7. The numbers shown in parentheses represent the path lengths of the leaf nodes. Let's compute the average path length of this tree. If we add up the path lengths of all the leaf nodes and divide by the total number of samples, which is 18, we obtain an average path length of 5.0. This is the actual average path length of tree 1. We can compute the average path length of tree 2 in exactly the same way. The two values will not be identical, but they should be fairly similar. Now, instead of measuring the average path length directly, let's see how we can estimate it theoretically. In a binary search tree, the expected average path length is commonly used to estimate the average search cost. Here, n denotes the number of samples. Since IsolationForest builds each tree from a random subset of the training data, n refers to the number of samples in the subset, not the entire dataset. The expected average path length, denoted by C of n, is defined as follows. The harmonic number h is given by the following equation. The constant term is Euler's constant. The authors of the IsolationForest paper used this result to estimate the anomaly score. In this example, the tree contains 18 samples. Using the equation for Cn, the expected average path length is approximately 4.93. This value is very close to the actual average path length of 5.0 that we computed earlier. As the number of isolation trees increases, the measured average path length approaches this theoretical value. The authors defined the anomaly score as follows. In this equation, h of x is the actual path length of sample x in a single isolation tree. And ehx is the average path length of sample x over all the trees in the forest. The value of Cn is the expected average path length that we just discussed. We could simply normalize the average path length by dividing eh of x by c of n and use the normalized value to detect outliers. However, the authors chose to express the anomaly score as an exponential function with base 2. This allows the score to range from 0 to 1. Now let's compute the anomaly score of the red outlier in the previous example. In tree 1, the path length of the red sample is 2. In tree 2, its path length is 3. Therefore, its average path length ehx is 2.5. Next, for simplicity, let's assume that our isolation forest contains only the tree shown on the left. The actual path length of the red sample is 2, and the expected average path length is 4.93. Substituting these values into the equation gives an anomaly score of approximately 0.755. Now let's compute the anomaly score for the blue sample with a path length of 3. Its anomaly score is approximately 0.656. Finally, let's compute the anomaly score for the blue sample at the very bottom of the tree. It has a path length of 7, and its anomaly score is approximately 0.374. The closer the anomaly score is to 1, the more likely the sample is to be an outlier. On the other hand, the closer the score is to 0, the more likely the sample is to be normal. In this example, the red sample has the highest anomaly score, so it is the most likely outlier. Using this score, we can easily identify outliers in the dataset. Next, let's look at the algorithms presented in the original IsolationForest paper. Algorithm 1 shows how to build an isolation forest. First, we randomly draw a subset from the training dataset. Next, we build an isolation tree using that subset. We repeat this process until we generate the desired number of isolation trees. Earlier, when we discussed the key idea of isolation forest, I explained that we keep splitting the tree until each leaf node contains only one sample. However, instead of growing the tree until each leaf node contains only one sample, the authors limited the maximum depth of the tree. They limited the maximum depth of the tree to the ceiling of log base 2 of psi. Here, psi represents the number of samples in the random subset. If the subset size is 16, the maximum tree depth is 4. For example, we can build a tree with a depth of 4, as shown here. As you can see, some leaf nodes still contain multiple samples. Even though the tree stops growing before every sample is completely isolated, we can still estimate the path length as if the tree had continued to grow until each leaf node contained only one sample. We'll see how this is done when we discuss Algorithm 3. Now let's move on to Algorithm 2, which describes how to build a single isolation tree. X is the subset of data used to build the tree, E represents the current depth of the tree, and L is the maximum tree depth that we just discussed. The algorithm randomly selects a feature and a split point, and recursively splits the data into left and right child nodes. If the current depth reaches the maximum tree depth, recursion stops, and the current node becomes a leaf node. Algorithm 3 computes the path length of a sample X in an isolation tree T. The algorithm recursively traverses the tree until it reaches the leaf node that contains sample X. Let's say sample X ends up in the node shown here. The path length from the root node to this leaf node is 4. This value is represented by the variable e in the algorithm. However, this leaf node still contains 3 samples. Ideally, we would continue splitting this node until only 1 sample remains in each leaf node. If we continued growing the tree, the path length of sample X would become larger. The question is, how much larger? As we discussed earlier, CN represents the expected average path length of a binary search tree containing n samples. In this example, the leaf node contains 3 samples. Therefore, the expected additional path length can be estimated using C3. If we compute C of 3 using this formula, we obtain approximately 1.2. This value represents the expected number of additional levels that would be required to isolate the samples completely. Therefore, the estimated path length of sample X is obtained by adding this value to the current path length. The current path length is 4, and the expected additional path length is 1.2. As a result, the estimated path length of sample X is 5.2. Instead of growing the tree all the way until every sample is isolated, it estimates the remaining path length using Cn. It's a clever idea that significantly reduces the computational cost without sacrificing much accuracy. Now that we understand the 3 algorithms presented in the paper, let's implement IsolationForest from scratch and compare the results with scikit-learn's IsolationForest model. This implementation is based on the algorithms we just discussed. We set the subsample size to 256, and we specify the number of isolation trees as 50. The maximum depth of each tree is computed using the formula we saw earlier. We then define a function that computes the expected average path length, C of n. Next, we implement a function that builds an isolation tree based on algorithm 2. If the current tree depth reaches the maximum depth, the recursion stops and the current node becomes a leaf node. Otherwise, the algorithm randomly selects a feature and continues splitting the node. A split point is randomly chosen within the range of the selected feature, and the data is recursively split into left and right child nodes. Next, we implement a function that estimates the path length of a sample based on algorithm 3. This function recursively traverses the tree until it reaches the leaf node containing sample X. It then estimates the final path length by adding the expected remaining path length to the current path length. Next, we generate a synthetic dataset containing 600 samples with 2 features using the makeBlobs function. Now let's detect outliers in this dataset. First, we build 50 isolation trees based on algorithm 1. Next, we estimate the path length of every sample in the dataset. We then compute the anomaly score for each sample. Finally, we identify the top 5% of samples with the highest anomaly scores as outliers. We then visualize the normal samples and the detected outliers. Here is the result. The blue points represent normal samples, and the red points represent outliers. You can see that the detected outliers are located far from the center of the overall data distribution. Next, let's detect outliers using scikit-learn's IsolationForest class. We create an IsolationForest model and classify each sample as either normal or an outlier. In scikit-learn, samples labeled as -1 are considered outliers. The visualization is shown here. As you can see, the result is very similar to the one produced by our own implementation. For comparison, here is the outlier detection result obtained using random forest in the previous lecture. Random forest detects outliers using a supervised learning approach, while IsolationForest uses an unsupervised learning approach. Because of this fundamental difference, the two methods produce different results. If you'd like to learn more about why they behave differently, please refer to the previous lecture. Now let's run this code and see what we get. Here's the output. Over the past 9 lectures, we've explored the random forest algorithm and many of its practical applications. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lecture.